The silence was the first thing Lady Caroline Ashfield noticed as her carriage approached Whitmore Abbey on that grey December morning. Not the natural quiet of the countryside, but something deeper, an absence of sound so profound it seemed to press against her ears like a physical weight. Even the servants who emerged to greet her moved with an eerie, practiced quietness, their footsteps muffled, their voices barely above whispers. Caroline clutched her worn reticule tighter as she stepped down from the carriage, her breath forming small clouds in the bitter air. At 19, she possessed little beyond her father's crushing debts and her own untested determination, but she had agreed to this marriage knowing it was her family's only salvation. What she hadn't expected was this oppressive atmosphere of enforced silence that seemed to shroud the magnificent estate like a burial shroud. "Lady Caroline," said a thin, severe woman who appeared at the Abbey's imposing entrance. "I am Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper. His Grace is waiting for you in the library." Caroline followed the woman through corridors lined with portraits of long-dead Whitmores, all of whom seemed to gaze down at her with expressions of stern disapproval. The Abbey was magnificent. Soaring ceilings, priceless tapestries, furniture that belonged in a museum, but there was something cold about it all, as if the very walls had forgotten how to welcome warmth or joy. The library doors opened to reveal a room that took Caroline's breath away. Floor-to-ceiling shelves stretched toward an ornate ceiling, filled with more books than she had ever seen in one place. But it was the man standing with his back to her, silhouetted against tall windows, who commanded her attention. Duke Jonathan Whitmore was younger than she had expected, perhaps 35, with dark hair that showed no trace of grey and broad shoulders that spoke of physical strength. When he turned to face her, Caroline felt her breath catch. He was devastatingly handsome, with sharp cheekbones and eyes the colour of winter storms, but there was something in his expression that made her heart ache, a profound isolation that seemed to emanate from his very soul. He inclined his head in a formal bow, his lips moving in what she assumed was a greeting, but no sound emerged. Caroline realized with a start that this was not mere politeness or preference. The Duke was deaf. "Your Grace," Caroline said, dropping into her deepest curtsy, unsure if he could read her lips or if someone had taught him to understand visual cues. The Duke's storm-grey eyes studied her face intently, and Caroline had the unsettling sensation that he was seeing far more than she was comfortable revealing. After a moment, he moved to a writing desk and picked up a piece of paper, writing quickly before handing it to her. "Welcome to Whitmore Abbey, Lady Caroline. I trust your journey was comfortable. We have much to discuss regarding our arrangement and the children." His handwriting was elegant, precise, the script of a man accustomed to communicating through written words rather than spoken ones. Caroline looked up from the note to find him watching her reaction carefully. "The journey was fine, thank you," Caroline said aloud, then hesitated. Could he read her lips? Should she write her response? The uncertainty made her feel clumsy and inadequate. The Duke seemed to sense her confusion. He wrote another note. "You may speak normally. I read lips quite well, though I cannot hear your voice. If you prefer to write, that is also acceptable." Caroline felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm sorry, I don't know the proper protocol for this situation." A ghost of what might have been a smile flickered across the Duke's features. "There is no protocol. We must find our own way." Before Caroline could respond, the library doors burst open, and 5 children tumbled in like a small avalanche. They moved with the same eerie quietness she had noticed in the servants, but their faces were alive with curiosity as they stared at their father's new wife. The eldest, a girl of perhaps 15 with her father's dark hair and serious grey eyes, stepped forward and performed a perfect curtsy. "Lady Caroline," she said, her voice carefully modulated to barely above a whisper. "I am Lady Margaret. These are my siblings, Lord Thomas, Lady Elizabeth, Lord William, and Lady Catherine." Caroline looked at the 5 young faces arranged before her like a tribunal and felt her heart sink. They ranged in age from what appeared to be 5 to 15, all bearing the unmistakable stamp of Whitmore breeding, and all watching her with expressions of polite wariness that reminded her painfully of their father. "It's lovely to meet you all," Caroline said, then glanced uncertainly at the Duke. Should she speak louder, softer? The children's whispered tones suggested that normal conversation might be inappropriate in this household. "The children have been taught to speak quietly," the Duke wrote, apparently noticing her confusion. "It is easier for me to read lips when there are no competing sounds, and it has become habit." Caroline felt a flash of something that might have been anger, These children had been forced to live in enforced silence for their father's convenience, denied the natural exuberance of childhood because their father could not hear their laughter. "Well," she said, deliberately speaking in her normal tone, "I'm very pleased to meet you all. I hope we can become friends." The children exchanged glances, clearly uncertain how to respond to this breach of their household's unspoken rules. The youngest, a little girl with golden curls and enormous grey eyes, took a tentative step forward. "Are you going to be our new mama?" Ami, she asked, in a voice so soft Caroline had to strain to hear it. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Caroline looked at the Duke, who was watching the exchange with an unreadable expression, then back at the 5 children who had lost their mother and were now faced with a stranger who was supposed to fill that impossible void. "I'm going to be your father's wife," Caroline said gently, "and I hope, if you'll let me, I can be your friend. I know I can never replace your mother, but perhaps we can find a way to be a family together." Little Catherine, who couldn't have been more than 5, considered this with the gravity of a judge. "Papa doesn't talk to us much anymore," she said matter-of-factly. "Not since Mama went to heaven. Will you talk to us?" The innocent question hit Caroline like a physical blow. She glanced at the Duke and saw him stiffen, his jaw tightening with what looked like pain or guilt. "Yes," Caroline said firmly, making a decision that would change everything. "I will talk to you. I will listen to you. And I think it's time this house remembered what it sounds like when children are allowed to be children." The Duke's head snapped up, his grey eyes flashing with something that might have been warning or anger. But Caroline held his gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated. "We will discuss household arrangements later," he wrote curtly. "Mrs. Hartwell will show you to your rooms. Dinner is at 7. As the Duke strode from the library without another glance, Caroline was left facing 5 children who looked as startled as she felt by their father's abrupt departure. "He doesn't like loud noises," Margaret explained quietly, her mature voice carrying a note of apology. "It makes him uncomfortable." "I see," Caroline said, though she was beginning to suspect there was far more to the Duke's preference for silence than simple discomfort. "Well, perhaps we can find a balance between consideration for your father and allowing you to express yourselves naturally." "You mean we could talk normally?" Thomas asked, his voice cracking slightly with adolescent uncertainty. "I mean," Caroline said with growing conviction, "that you're children, and children should be allowed to laugh and play and speak their minds. We just need to be thoughtful about when and where we do it." The transformation in their faces was immediate and heartbreaking. These children had been living under a blanket of enforced quiet for so long that the simple permission to speak normally seemed like a miraculous gift. "Could we show you the house?" Elizabeth asked, her voice gaining strength with each word. "There are secret passages and a tower room where you can see all the way to London on clear days." "I would love that," Caroline said warmly. "But first, perhaps someone could tell me about your father. Help me understand what I need to know to be a good wife to him." The children exchanged glances again, and Caroline sensed she was treading on dangerous ground. Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice careful and measured. "Papa wasn't always like this," she said slowly. "Before Mama died, before he lost his hearing, he was different. He used to laugh with us, play games, tell stories. But after the accident—" "Accident?" Caroline prompted gently. "The fever," Thomas said quietly. 3 years ago. Mama caught it first, then Papa. She died, and when Papa recovered, he couldn't hear anymore. The doctors said the fever damaged something in his ears." Caroline felt her heart clench with sympathy. The Duke hadn't just lost his wife. He had lost his ability to hear his children's voices, to participate in the normal rhythms of family life. No wonder he had withdrawn into himself. "He blames himself," William added, his young voice heavy with understanding beyond his years. "He thinks if he had been able to hear Mama calling for help that night, he might have saved her." The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place for Caroline. The Duke's isolation wasn't just about his deafness, it was about guilt, grief, and a profound sense of failure that had driven him to cut himself off from everything that might remind him of what he had lost. "That must be very hard for all of you," Caroline said softly. "Losing your mother and then feeling like you lost your father too." "We manage," Margaret said, with the stoic dignity of a girl who had been forced to grow up too quickly. "We take care of each other." Caroline looked at these 5 remarkable children who had learned to navigate their grief and their father's withdrawal with such grace and felt a surge of protective love that surprised her with its intensity. They deserved better than a father who had retreated into silence and a stepmother who was little more than a stranger fulfilling a contractual obligation. "Well," she said with determination, "now you have me to help take care of you, and perhaps, together, we can find a way to help your father remember that life is still worth living." As the children led her through the Abbey's magnificent rooms, chattering with increasing enthusiasm as they grew more comfortable with her presence, Caroline began to understand the magnitude of the task before her. She wasn't just expected to manage a household and raise 5 children. She was expected to heal a family that had been shattered by loss and silence. But as she watched little Catherine skip ahead of them, her golden curls bouncing with each step, and heard Thomas laugh at one of William's jokes, Caroline felt something she hadn't experienced since her father's financial ruin had destroyed her own family's security. Hope. These children wanted to be saved. They were hungry for affection, for attention, for the simple joy of being heard and understood. And their father, despite his withdrawal and his walls of silence, was still a man capable of love. She had seen it in the way his eyes followed his children, in the careful way he had written his notes to her. The question was whether Caroline had the strength, the patience, and the courage to break through the barriers that grief and guilt had built around the Duke's heart. Whether she could teach a man who lived in silence that sometimes the most important conversations happened without words. As night fell over Whitmore Abbey and Caroline prepared for her first dinner as the new Duchess, she made herself a promise. She would not simply fulfill the terms of their marriage contract. She would fight for this family, for these children, and for the man who had forgotten how to hope. The silence might be profound, but love, Caroline was beginning to believe, could be louder than any sound. Breaking the silence. Dinner at Whitmore Abbey was a study in controlled quiet that bordered on the surreal. The massive dining room, which could have easily accommodated 50 guests, felt cavernous with just 7 people seated around one end of the polished mahogany table. The children ate with the precise manners of miniature adults, their conversation limited to whispered requests for salt or polite inquiries about each other's studies. The Duke sat at the head of the table like a statue carved from marble, his attention focused entirely on his plate. He had changed into formal evening wear, a perfectly tailored black coat that emphasized his broad shoulders and a white cravat that made his storm-grey eyes appear even more intense. Caroline found herself stealing glances at him throughout the meal, trying to reconcile this remote, silent man with the loving father his children had described. "Lady Caroline," Margaret said softly, her voice barely audible above the gentle clink of silverware, "Mrs. Hartwell mentioned that you enjoy reading. Our library is quite extensive, if you would care to explore it." "I would love that," Caroline replied, then made a deliberate choice to speak in her normal tone rather than matching the children's whispers. "What sorts of books do you enjoy?" The question seemed to catch Margaret off guard, as if she wasn't accustomed to adults taking interest in her preferences. I quite enjoy poetry," she admitted, her voice gaining slight strength. "Lord Byron, particularly, though Papa says his work is rather scandalous for young ladies." Caroline glanced at the Duke, who was watching their exchange with sharp attention. His ability to read lips was clearly excellent because she saw his mouth tighten slightly at Margaret's admission. "Poetry can be a wonderful way to understand human emotion," Caroline said diplomatically. "Perhaps we could read some together and discuss what makes certain works so powerful." "Really?" Elizabeth chimed in, her voice rising with excitement before she caught herself and glanced nervously at her father. "I mean," she continued in a whisper, "that would be lovely." Caroline felt her heart break a little at the way the girl had immediately suppressed her natural enthusiasm. These children were walking on eggshells in their own home, afraid to express joy or excitement for fear of disturbing their father's carefully maintained silence. "What about you, Thomas?" Caroline asked, turning to the boy who appeared to be about 13. "What are your interests?" Thomas looked uncertain, as if he wasn't sure whether answering would be appropriate. I like mathematics," he said quietly, "and engineering. I've been reading about the new steam engines they're building for the railways." "How fascinating," Caroline said warmly. "I confess I know very little about such things. Perhaps you could explain some of the principles to me." The boy's face lit up with the first genuine smile Caroline had seen from any of the children. "I could show you my drawings," he offered eagerly, then immediately looked toward his father with apprehension. The Duke had gone very still, his grey eyes fixed on his son's animated face with an expression Caroline couldn't quite read. For a moment she thought she saw longing there, a father's desire to share in his child's enthusiasm, but it was quickly replaced by the familiar mask of remote politeness. "The children retire early," the Duke wrote on a piece of paper, passing it to Caroline. "They have lessons at 8 each morning." "Of course," Caroline said aloud, then made another deliberate choice. "But perhaps before they go to bed we could spend some time together in the drawing room. I'd love to hear more about your studies and interests." The children exchanged glances of barely contained excitement, but their eyes immediately went to their father for permission. The Duke hesitated, his pen hovering over the paper as if he were wrestling with some internal debate. "Very well," he finally wrote, but quietly. "The evening is meant for reflection, not excitement." Caroline bit back her first response, which would have been to point out that children needed excitement and joy as much as they needed reflection. Instead, she simply nodded and smiled at the children, who looked as if they had been granted an unexpected holiday. The drawing room was another magnificent space that felt more like a museum than a family gathering place. Priceless artwork adorned the walls, and the furniture was arranged with the kind of formal precision that discouraged casual comfort. But as the children settled around Caroline near the fireplace, the room began to feel more alive. "Now then," Caroline said, keeping her voice at a moderate level that wouldn't startle the Duke, but wasn't the whisper the children were accustomed to. "Tell me about yourselves. What do you love? What makes you happy? What do you dream about?" The questions seemed to overwhelm them with their scope and permission. These children had clearly been living in such a restricted environment that they had forgotten how to express their own desires and dreams. "I want to be a poet," Elizabeth said suddenly, the words tumbling out as if they had been held back for years. "I write verses sometimes in secret, about the gardens and the sky and how it feels to miss someone." Caroline felt tears prick her eyes at the girl's brave admission. "That sounds beautiful, Elizabeth. Would you share some of your poetry with me sometime? You wouldn't think it was silly?" "I think poetry is one of the most important forms of human expression," Caroline said firmly. "It takes great courage to put your feelings into words." "I want to build bridges," Thomas announced, emboldened by his sister's example. "Great spans that connect places that were separated before. I've been designing them in my notebooks." "And I want to learn to paint," William added, his young voice gaining confidence. "Real paintings, not just the watercolors ladies are supposed to do. I want to paint portraits that show what people are really feeling inside." Caroline looked around at these remarkable children who had been suppressing their dreams and ambitions in deference to their father's grief, and felt a surge of protective anger. They deserved encouragement, support, the freedom to pursue their passions with enthusiasm. "What about you, Catherine?" Caroline asked gently, turning to the youngest. "What do you love to do?" The little girl looked uncertain, as if she wasn't sure her answer would be acceptable. "I like to sing," she whispered, "but only when Papa isn't home. Margaret says it might hurt his feelings because he can't hear music anymore." The admission hit Caroline like a physical blow. This precious child had been denied the simple joy of singing because the adults in her life were so focused on protecting her father's feelings that they had forgotten about her own needs. "Singing is a wonderful gift," Caroline said firmly. "Music brings joy to the world, and I think your mother would want you to share that gift." "Do you really think so?" Catherine asked, her grey eyes wide with hope. "I know so," Caroline said with conviction. "In fact, I think we should have music in this house again. Not to hurt anyone's feelings, but to honor the beauty and joy that music represents." It was at that moment that Caroline became aware of a presence in the doorway. She turned to find the Duke standing there, his face a mask of controlled fury. How long had he been watching? How much of their conversation had he witnessed? The children noticed their father's presence immediately, their animated chatter dying as if someone had snuffed out a candle. The transformation was heartbreaking. 5 bright, enthusiastic young people, instantly reverting to the subdued, careful creatures they had been trained to become. "It is time for the children to retire," the Duke wrote curtly, handing the note to Margaret rather than Caroline. "Yes, Papa," Margaret said quietly, rising with the automatic obedience of a child accustomed to unquestioned authority. "Come along, everyone." As the children filed past their father with whispered goodnights, Caroline saw little Catherine hesitate. The child looked up at the Duke with such longing, such desperate hope for some sign of affection, that Caroline had to look away. The Duke's expression softened slightly as he looked down at his youngest daughter, and for a moment, Caroline thought he might reach out to her, might offer the comfort and love the child so clearly craved. But the moment passed. and Catherine continued on her way with the resigned acceptance of a 5-year-old who had learned not to expect too much. When they were alone, the Duke turned to Caroline with an expression that could have frozen fire. "We need to discuss boundaries," he wrote with sharp, angry strokes. "Yes, we do," Caroline agreed, rising to face him directly. "Those children are starving for affection, for attention, for the simple right to be young and enthusiastic about life. They're walking on eggshells in their own home. They are learning discipline and proper behavior. They're learning to suppress every natural impulse," Caroline shot back. "They're afraid to laugh, afraid to sing, afraid to show excitement about anything because they might disturb your precious silence." The Duke's eyes flashed with anger, and he wrote furiously, "You know nothing about what this family has endured. You have been here one day and presume to judge how I raise my children." "I'm not judging how you raise them," Caroline said, fighting to keep her voice level. "I'm questioning whether you're raising them at all, or simply expecting them to raise themselves while you hide from anything that might remind you of what you've lost." The words hung between them like a gauntlet thrown down. Caroline knew she had crossed a line, had said things that couldn't be taken back. But as she looked at this man who was so lost in his own grief that he couldn't see his children's pain, she found she didn't regret her boldness. "You will not speak to me about loss," the Duke wrote, his handwriting becoming increasingly erratic with emotion. "You are 19 years old and have never lost anything more significant than a dance partner." "You're right," Caroline said quietly. "I haven't lost a spouse or my hearing, but I have lost my family's security, my future, my sense of belonging anywhere. And I know what it feels like to watch people you love suffer unnecessarily." The Duke stared at her for a long moment, and Caroline could see him struggling with emotions he clearly preferred to keep buried. "The children are content," he wrote finally. "The children are surviving," Caroline corrected. "There's a difference. They're good children, remarkable children, and they deserve better than a father who has given up on joy. Joy," the Duke wrote with bitter precision, "is a luxury I can no longer afford." "Why?" Caroline challenged. "Because you think feeling happiness somehow dishonors your wife's memory. Because you believe that if you allow yourself to love your children fully, you might risk losing them too." The Duke went very still, his grey eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. She had hit close to the truth, she realized, perhaps closer than he was comfortable with. "You understand nothing," he wrote, but his handwriting lacked the conviction of his earlier responses. "Then help me understand," Caroline said gently, her anger giving way to compassion. "Tell me about her. Tell me about the woman you loved, the mother your children remember. Help me understand what you're so afraid of losing." For a moment, the Duke's carefully constructed walls seemed to waver. Caroline saw grief in his eyes, and longing, and a pain so profound it took her breath away. But then the barriers slammed back into place, and he was once again the remote stranger she had married. "Good night, Lady Caroline," he wrote with finality. "I trust you will find your chambers comfortable." As he walked away, leaving her alone in the vast drawing room with its cold magnificence and oppressive silence, Caroline felt the full weight of what she had undertaken settling on her shoulders. She wasn't just expected to be a wife and stepmother, she was expected to heal a man who didn't want to be healed, to reach children who had been taught that love was dangerous, to bring life back to a house that had forgotten how to breathe. But as she made her way to her chambers, Caroline found herself thinking not about the Duke's anger or the children's careful restraint, but about the moments when their true selves had shone through. Elizabeth's poetry, Thomas's engineering dreams, William's artistic aspirations, Catherine's love of music, and Margaret's quiet wisdom. These children wanted to be saved. They were hungry for the kind of love and attention that would allow them to flourish. And their father, despite his walls and his silence, was still capable of feeling. She had seen it in his eyes when he looked at Catherine, in the way his expression had softened, despite his determination to remain distant. Tomorrow, Caroline decided, she would begin the real work of becoming part of this family, not just fulfilling the terms of a marriage contract, but fighting for the hearts and souls of 6 people who had forgotten that healing was possible. The silence might be profound, but Caroline was beginning to understand that sometimes the most important battles were fought without words. The language of hearts. Caroline woke before dawn on her second morning at Whitmore Abbey, not from any sense of duty, but because sleep had proven elusive in the enormous 4-poster bed that dominated her chambers. The room was beautiful, decorated in shades of blue and gold that complemented the winter light streaming through tall windows. But it felt impersonal, like a guest room in a grand hotel rather than a home. She dressed quietly in one of her simple morning gowns and made her way through the Abbey's corridors, guided by instinct toward what she hoped would be the kitchens. If she was going to understand this family and find ways to reach them, she needed to understand how the household operated when the Duke wasn't watching. The kitchens were a revelation of warmth and activity that stood in stark contrast to the formal silence of the rest of the house. Here, at least, people moved and spoke with something approaching normalcy, though even their conversations were conducted in hushed tones. "Your Grace!" exclaimed a plump, motherly woman who could only be the cook. "We weren't expecting... That is, the family doesn't usually..." "Please, don't let me interrupt," Caroline said quickly. "I'm Caroline, and I was hoping to understand how breakfast is typically managed. I'd like to be helpful rather than simply ornamental." The cook, Mrs. Pemberton, she introduced herself, looked uncertain about how to respond to a duchess who wanted to be helpful. "Well, Your Grace, we usually serve the children in the morning room at 8, and His Grace takes his meals in his study. He prefers not to be disturbed during the morning hours." Caroline felt a familiar flash of irritation at the Duke's continued isolation from his children, but she kept her voice calm. "I see. And what do the children typically eat?" "Simple fare, Your Grace. Porridge, toast, perhaps some eggs. His Grace believes in moderation in all things." "And what would they eat if they could choose for themselves?" Caroline asked with a conspiratorial smile. Mrs. Pemberton's face lit up with understanding. "Oh, well, Lady Catherine does love strawberry jam, and Master Thomas has quite a fondness for honey cakes. Lady Elizabeth always asks if there might be chocolate, though of course we don't usually." "Then perhaps," Caroline said with growing determination, "we could make this morning a bit special. Nothing too elaborate, but something that might bring a smile to their faces." For the next hour, Caroline worked alongside the kitchen staff to prepare what she privately thought of as a rebellion breakfast. There were honey cakes and strawberry jam, hot chocolate alongside the usual tea, and fresh fruit arranged in colorful patterns that would appeal to young eyes. "Your Grace," Mrs. Pemberton said as they worked, "if I may say so, it's wonderful to see someone taking an interest in the children's happiness. They've been so subdued since their mother passed." "Tell me about her," Caroline said impulsively. "The late Duchess. What was she like?" Mrs. Pemberton's face grew soft with memory. "Oh, she was a lovely lady, Your Grace. Always laughing, always finding ways to bring joy to the house. She used to come down to the kitchens herself, teaching the children to bake, letting them make messes and not caring a bit about propriety." "And the Duke? What was he like before?" "A different man entirely," Mrs. Pemberton said with a sigh. "He adored his wife, doted on those children. You could hear his laughter echoing through the halls, see him chasing the little ones through the gardens. But after the fever, after he lost his hearing and she died," she shook her head sadly. "It's as if he buried his heart with her." Caroline absorbed this information as she helped arrange the breakfast service. The Duke hadn't always been the cold, distant man she had married. He had been a loving husband and father who had been broken by loss and transformed by grief into someone who was afraid to feel anything at all. When 8 o'clock arrived, Caroline made her way to the morning room with a sense of nervous anticipation. The children were already seated around a smaller, more intimate table than the massive dining room furniture, their faces showing polite expectation rather than enthusiasm. "Good morning," Caroline said warmly, taking her seat among them rather than at the head of the table. "I hope you slept well." "Good morning, Lady Caroline," they chorused in their careful whispers, but Caroline noticed their eyes widening as the servants began bringing in the enhanced breakfast service. "Is that chocolate?" Elizabeth asked in wonder, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself. "It is indeed," Caroline confirmed. "I thought we might start the day with something a bit special." "But Papa says," Thomas began, then stopped, clearly torn between desire and duty. "Your Papa isn't here," Caroline said gently, "and I think sometimes it's important to celebrate the simple pleasure of being alive and together." Little Catherine clapped her hands together with delight when she saw the strawberry jam, and for a moment the morning room was filled with something it had been missing for far too long, the sound of children being children. "Tell me about your lessons," Caroline said as they ate. "What are you studying today?" "Latin with Mr. Thornfield," Margaret replied, though she was clearly distracted by the honey cake on her plate. "And mathematics." Lady Elizabeth and I have French with Mademoiselle Dubois. And I have drawing, William added eagerly. Though Mr. Thornfield says I should focus more on my penmanship and less on artistic pursuits. Caroline felt another flash of anger at the way these children's natural talents were being discouraged in favor of rigid propriety. What sort of things do you like to draw, William? The boy's face lit up. Everything. The gardens, the horses, people's faces when they think no one is watching. I like to capture the moments when people forget to be proper and just are. That sounds like a wonderful gift, Caroline said warmly. Perhaps you could show me some of your work later. Really? You wouldn't think it was frivolous? I think art is one of the most important ways we have of understanding the world around us, Caroline said firmly. Anyone who tells you otherwise simply doesn't understand the value of seeing beauty and truth. As breakfast continued, Caroline watched the children gradually relax in her presence. Their voices grew slightly louder, their laughter more frequent, their natural personalities beginning to emerge from beneath the layers of enforced propriety. It was Thomas who noticed their father first. "Papa," he said quietly, his voice immediately dropping back to a whisper as the Duke appeared in the doorway. The transformation in the children was immediate and heartbreaking. 5 bright, animated young people instantly became the subdued, careful creatures their father expected them to be. But this time, Caroline was determined not to let the moment pass without comment. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said in her normal speaking voice, rising to greet her husband. "Would you care to join us? We were just discussing the children's studies." The Duke's grey eyes swept over the breakfast table, taking in the honey cakes, the chocolate, the evidence of what he clearly saw as inappropriate indulgence. His jaw tightened, and Caroline could see the disapproval in every line of his body. "The children have lessons," he wrote curtly. "They should not be distracted by frivolity." "Learning can take many forms," Caroline replied evenly. "Sometimes the most important lessons happen when we're relaxed and comfortable enough to think freely." The Duke's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or frustration. He wrote another note. "Structure and discipline are what children need, not indulgence." "What children need," Caroline said, her voice gaining strength, "is love, encouragement, and the freedom to discover who they're meant to become. They need to know that their happiness matters, that their dreams are worth pursuing." The silence that followed was charged with tension. The children sat frozen, clearly terrified of being caught in the middle of their father and stepmother's disagreement. But Caroline refused to back down. "Perhaps," she continued more gently, "we could find a balance between structure and joy, between honoring your late wife's memory and allowing your children to create new memories of their own." The Duke went very still at the mention of his first wife, and Caroline saw something flicker in his eyes, pain, longing, and something that might have been fear. "You will not speak of my wife," he wrote with sharp, angry strokes. "Why?" Caroline challenged. "Because remembering her hurts? Because acknowledging that she would want her children to be happy forces you to confront your own choices?" The Duke's face went white with fury, and for a moment Caroline thought he might actually shout at her, an impossibility that somehow made the moment even more charged with emotion. Instead, he turned on his heel and stalked from the room, leaving behind a silence that felt different from his usual controlled quiet. This was the silence of shock, of words that couldn't be taken back, of a family teetering on the edge of change. "Lady Caroline," Margaret said quietly, her young voice heavy with concern, "Papa doesn't like to talk about Mama. It makes him too sad." "I know, sweetheart," Caroline said gently, settling back into her chair. "But sometimes we have to talk about difficult things in order to heal from them. Your father is in pain, and he's been carrying that pain alone for too long." "Will he be angry with us?" Catherine asked, her grey eyes wide with worry. "No," Caroline said firmly. "Your father loves you very much, even if he has trouble showing it right now. He's not angry with you. He's angry with me for challenging him, and that's all right. Sometimes people need to be challenged in order to grow." As the children finished their breakfast and prepared for their lessons, Caroline found herself thinking about the Duke's reaction to her words. She had seen something in his eyes when she mentioned his wife. Not just pain, but fear. He wasn't just grieving, he was terrified of something. But what? What could frighten a man who had already lost everything he thought mattered most? The answer came to her as she watched little Catherine skip toward the schoolroom, her golden curls bouncing with each step. The Duke wasn't just afraid of remembering his wife. He was afraid of loving his children too much, of opening his heart to the possibility of loss again. He had convinced himself that distance was protection, that if he didn't allow himself to feel too deeply, he couldn't be hurt again. But in protecting himself, he was denying his children the very thing they needed most: a father who loved them without reservation. Caroline made her way to the library, hoping to find some clue about the man she had married, some insight into the person he had been before grief changed him. The room was as magnificent as she remembered, but now she noticed details that had escaped her attention the day before. There were gaps on the shelves where books had been removed, empty spaces that suggested volumes had been deliberately taken away. A writing desk sat in the corner, its surface clear except for the basic implements of correspondence. But most telling of all were the portraits, or rather, the absence of them. The library walls, which should have been adorned with family pictures, were bare except for landscapes and formal ancestral paintings. No wedding portraits, no family gatherings, no candid moments of domestic happiness. It was as if the Duke had systematically removed every reminder of the life he had shared with his first wife. "He took them down after the funeral," said a quiet voice behind her. Caroline turned to find Margaret standing in the doorway, her expression wise beyond her 15 years. "The portraits?" Caroline asked gently. Margaret nodded. "All of them. Every picture of Mama, every family portrait, everything that showed us. Happy. He said it was too painful to look at them." "And how do you feel about that?" The girl was quiet for a moment, clearly struggling with loyalty to her father and her own need to remember her mother. "I understand why he did it," she said finally. "But sometimes I worry that we're forgetting what she looked like when she smiled, what we looked like when we were all together." Caroline felt her heart break for this wise, mature girl who had been forced to carry burdens far beyond her years. "Would you like to remember?" she asked impulsively. "Would you like to see those pictures again?" Margaret's eyes widened with longing and fear in equal measure. "Papa would be so angry." "Not if we approached it the right way," Caroline said thoughtfully. "Not if we helped him understand that remembering the joy doesn't diminish the love." As Margaret hurried off to her lessons, Caroline remained in the library, surrounded by the echoes of a family that had once been whole. She was beginning to understand the magnitude of what she had undertaken, but she was also beginning to see a path forward. The Duke had built walls around his heart to protect himself from further pain, but those same walls were suffocating his children and denying them the father they desperately needed. If Caroline could find a way to show him that love wasn't a risk to be avoided, but a gift to be cherished, perhaps she could help him remember that some things were worth the possibility of loss. But first, she needed to understand exactly what had happened during that terrible fever. What had broken this man so completely that he had chosen silence over the sound of his children's laughter? The answers, she suspected, lay not in the formal spaces of the Abbey, but in the places where real life had once flourished. The family quarters, the nursery, the private spaces where the Duke and his first wife had built their life together. And Caroline was determined to find them, no matter how much resistance she encountered along the way. The sound of memory. Caroline's opportunity to explore the more private areas of Whitmore Abbey came sooner than expected. The Duke had departed that afternoon for what Mrs. Hartwell described as estate business in the village, though Caroline suspected it was more likely an escape from the tension that had filled the house since their morning confrontation. With the children occupied in their lessons and the Duke safely away, Caroline made her way to the family wing of the Abbey, guided by her instinct and the occasional helpful direction from sympathetic servants who seemed to understand her mission without it being explicitly stated. The family quarters told a story of love interrupted. The Duke's chambers were spartanly furnished, stripped of any personal touches that might evoke memory or emotion. But the adjoining rooms, clearly once belonging to his wife, remained exactly as they had been 3 years ago, preserved like a shrine to a life cut tragically short. Caroline stepped into what had obviously been the Duchess's private sitting room and felt her breath catch. Here was the warmth and personality that was so conspicuously absent from the rest of the Abbey. Watercolor paintings, clearly done by an amateur but loving hand, adorned the walls, depicting the children at various ages. Books lay open on tables as if their reader had just stepped away for a moment. A piece of embroidery sat half-finished in a basket by the window, the needle still threaded as if waiting for its owner's return. But it was the portrait above the fireplace that made Caroline's heart stop. The late Duchess had been beautiful, certainly, but it was the joy in her painted eyes that was truly striking. She sat surrounded by her 5 children, all of them laughing at some shared joke, while the Duke stood behind them with his hands on his wife's shoulders and an expression of such complete contentment that it was almost painful to witness. "She was beautiful, wasn't she?" said a soft voice behind her. Caroline turned to find little Catherine standing in the doorway, her grey eyes fixed on the portrait with a mixture of love and longing. "She was," Caroline agreed gently. "But more than that, she looks happy. You all look happy." "We were," Catherine said simply. "Before the sickness came, we were the happiest family in all of England. Papa used to say so every night when he tucked us into bed." Caroline knelt down to the child's level. "Tell me about that time, sweetheart. What was it like when your mama was alive?" Catherine's face lit up with memory. "Papa used to chase us through the gardens, and Mama would laugh so hard she had to sit down. We had picnics by the lake, and Papa would read us stories in funny voices. Mama taught us to dance, and Papa would play the piano while we twirled around the music room." The image of the Duke playing piano, of this silent man creating music for his dancing children, was almost impossible to reconcile with the remote figure Caroline had married. "Your papa played piano?" she asked gently. "Oh yes," Catherine said with enthusiasm. "He was wonderful at it. He could play anything, Mozart, Beethoven, even silly songs that made us giggle. But after Mama died and he couldn't hear any more, he stopped. He said there was no point in making music if you couldn't hear it." Caroline felt tears prick her eyes at the tragedy of it all. The Duke hadn't just lost his wife and his hearing. He had lost his ability to share in one of life's greatest joys, the creation of beauty through music. "Would you like to see the music room?" Catherine asked suddenly. "It's been locked since Mama died, but I know where Mrs. Hartwell keeps the key." Caroline hesitated, knowing that exploring locked rooms without the Duke's permission was a serious breach of trust. But the hope in Catherine's eyes, the desperate need to reconnect with happier memories, decided her. "Show me," she said quietly. The music room was a revelation of abandoned beauty. A magnificent grand piano sat in the center of the space, its surface covered with a dust sheet like a shroud. Music stands held sheet music that had been left open 3 years ago, and the walls were lined with instruments of every description: violins, flutes, a small harp that must have belonged to one of the older children. Catherine ran to the piano and carefully lifted the dust sheet, revealing polished ebony that gleamed even in the dim light filtering through closed curtains. "Mama used to say that music was the language of the heart," Catherine said softly, running her small fingers over the keys without pressing them. "She said it could say things that words couldn't express." "Your mama was very wise," Caroline said, moving to stand beside the child. "Would you like me to open the curtains? Let some light into this beautiful room." Catherine nodded eagerly, and together they pulled back the heavy drapes, flooding the space with afternoon sunlight that revealed the room's true magnificence. This had been a place of joy, of family gatherings, of shared music and laughter. Could you play something?" Catherine asked hesitantly. "I know Papa can't hear it, but maybe the music would still be here, even if he can't listen to it." Caroline's heart clenched at the child's innocent wisdom. She wasn't an accomplished musician, but she could manage simple pieces, and the idea of bringing music back to this silent house was too compelling to resist. She settled at the piano bench and began to play a simple melody. Nothing elaborate, just a gentle tune that seemed to fit the afternoon light and the hope in a little girl's eyes. The piano was perfectly tuned, its voice rich and warm in the acoustics of the room. Catherine began to hum along, her sweet voice adding harmony to the simple melody. Soon, drawn by the unprecedented sound of music in Whitmore Abbey, the other children appeared in the doorway. Are you playing the piano?" Thomas asked in wonder, as if witnessing a miracle. "Would you like to join us?" Caroline asked, continuing to play. "I'm sure your mother would want this room to be filled with music again." What followed was the most natural thing in the world. Elizabeth began to sing softly, her voice blending beautifully with Catherine's. William picked up a violin and began to add a simple accompaniment, while Thomas and Margaret simply listened with expressions of joy that Caroline hadn't seen since her arrival. For the first time since coming to Whitmore Abbey, Caroline felt like she was witnessing this family as they were meant to be. Not the careful, subdued creatures they had become, but vibrant young people with talents and dreams and the capacity for happiness. It was Margaret who noticed him first. "Papa," she whispered, her voice cutting through the music like a blade. Caroline's hands stilled on the keys as she turned to see the Duke standing in the doorway, his face a mask of such pain and fury that she felt her breath catch. How long had he been there? How much had he witnessed? The children immediately fell silent, their joy evaporating like mist before the storm of their father's disapproval. But Caroline refused to be cowed. She rose from the piano bench and faced him directly. "The children have beautiful voices," she said calmly, "and considerable musical talent. It seems a shame to waste such gifts." The Duke's grey eyes blazed with emotion as he strode into the room, his movements sharp with barely controlled anger. He went directly to the piano and slammed the lid shut with such force that everyone jumped. "This room is to remain closed," he wrote furiously, his handwriting jagged with emotion. "These instruments are not to be touched." "Why?" Caroline challenged, her own temper beginning to rise. "Because they remind you of what you've lost, because hearing your children's happiness is too painful for you to bear." "You have no right," the Duke wrote, his pen scoring the paper with angry strokes. "No right to bring them here, to fill their heads with false hopes, to make them remember things that can never be again." "What can never be again?" Caroline shot back. "Their talent, their joy, their right to express themselves through music, or simply their right to be happy in their own home?" The Duke's face went white with fury, and Caroline saw his hands tremble as he wrote his response. "Their mother is dead. The music died with her. There is no point in pretending otherwise." "The music didn't die," Caroline said firmly, her voice carrying clearly in the acoustics of the room. "It's been waiting for someone to remember that beauty doesn't disappear just because we can't bear to acknowledge it." She moved to the piano and lifted the lid again, her movements deliberate and challenging. "Your wife may be gone, but her children are still here. They still have voices, still have talents, still have the capacity for joy. Are you really going to deny them that because you're afraid of remembering what you've lost?" The Duke stared at her for a long moment, his chest rising and falling with the effort to control his emotions. Then, without warning, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind a silence that felt different from his usual controlled quiet. This was the silence of a man pushed beyond his limits. "Lady Caroline," Margaret said quietly, her voice heavy with concern, "perhaps we should—" "No," Caroline said firmly, settling back at the piano bench. "We should not hide from beauty, because someone else is afraid of it. Catherine, would you sing for me again?" The little girl looked uncertain, glancing toward the door where her father had disappeared. "But Papa, your Papa is hurting," Caroline said gently. "But that doesn't mean you have to stop living." "Your Mama wouldn't want that, would she?" Catherine shook her head slowly, then began to hum the melody they had been playing before. One by one, the other children joined in, their voices creating a harmony that filled the room with something it had been missing for far too long. As they sang, Caroline found herself thinking about the Duke's reaction, about the pain she had seen in his eyes when he looked at the piano, when he heard his children's voices raised in song. He wasn't just grieving his wife, he was grieving the man he had been, the father who had once shared in his children's joy, the husband who had created music for the woman he loved. But grief, Caroline was beginning to understand, could be transformed. It didn't have to be a wall that separated him from his children. It could be a bridge that connected him to the love they had all shared. The question was whether the Duke was brave enough to cross that bridge, or whether he would continue to live in the silence he had created, surrounded by the echoes of a happiness he was too afraid to reclaim. As the afternoon light faded and the children's voices filled the music room with hope, Caroline made herself a promise. She would not give up on this family. She would not accept that love was too dangerous to risk, that joy was too painful to pursue. She would find a way to reach the man who had forgotten how to hear the music of his own heart. The language of love. The Duke did not appear for dinner that evening, and Caroline found herself dining alone with the children in an atmosphere of nervous tension. The afternoon's confrontation in the music room had shaken everyone, and the children seemed uncertain whether they should feel guilty for their moment of joy or defiant in the face of their father's disapproval. "Is Papa very angry with us?" Catherine asked quietly as they finished their meal. "Your Papa isn't angry with you," Caroline assured her. "He's struggling with his own feelings, and sometimes when people are in pain, they lash out at the things that remind them of what they've lost." "But we weren't trying to hurt him," William said, his young voice heavy with confusion. "We were just being happy." "I know, sweetheart," Caroline said gently, "and you have every right to be happy. Your father will understand that eventually." Margaret, wise beyond her years, looked at Caroline with searching eyes. "What if he doesn't? What if he never forgives us for remembering what it was like before?" The question cut straight to the heart of Caroline's fears. What if the Duke was too damaged by grief to ever find his way back to his children? What if her efforts to heal this family only drove him further away? Then we'll keep loving him anyway, Caroline said firmly. Sometimes love means being patient with people who are too hurt to love us back properly, but that doesn't mean we stop trying. After the children had been sent to bed, Caroline made her way through the Abbey's corridors, guided by instinct and determination toward the Duke's private study. She found him there, as she had expected, sitting behind his massive desk with a brandy snifter in his hand and an expression of such profound isolation that it took her breath away. He looked up when she entered, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight like storm clouds lit by lightning. For a moment, neither of them moved, the weight of their earlier confrontation hanging between them like a challenge. "You should not be here," he wrote without looking away from her face. "Where should I be?" Caroline asked, settling into the chair across from his desk without waiting for permission. "In my rooms, pretending that this afternoon didn't happen. Pretending that your children don't need their father?" The Duke's jaw tightened, but he didn't write a response. Instead, he took a long sip of his brandy and stared into the fire as if it might provide answers to questions he was afraid to ask. "Tell me about her," Caroline said quietly. "Tell me about the woman you loved, the mother your children remember. Help me understand what you're so afraid of losing." The Duke's hand stilled on his glass, and Caroline saw something flicker in his eyes, surprise perhaps at her directness, or maybe recognition that she wasn't going to be easily dismissed. "You would not understand," he wrote finally, his handwriting careful and controlled. "Try me," Caroline challenged gently. "I may be young, but I'm not naive. I know what it means to lose everything you thought your future held." The Duke studied her face for a long moment, as if weighing whether she could be trusted with his pain. Finally, he set down his pen and moved to a cabinet in the corner of the room. From it, he withdrew a small portrait, a miniature that he handled with the reverence of a man touching something sacred. He placed it on the desk between them, and Caroline found herself looking at the most beautiful woman she had ever seen. Not just physically beautiful, though the late Duchess had certainly been that, but radiant with a joy and warmth that seemed to emanate from the painted surface. Her name was Isabella, the Duke wrote, his handwriting softer now, more vulnerable. "We were childhood sweethearts, married when she was 18 and I was 22. She was everything, light and laughter and music and hope. She made everything better simply by existing." Caroline felt her heart clench at the love evident in every word. "She sounds wonderful." She was. The Duke's pen paused, and Caroline could see him struggling with memories that were both precious and painful. "She loved the children with a fierceness that took my breath away. She would spend hours with them, reading, singing, teaching them to dance, to paint, to find joy in the smallest things. She said that childhood was sacred, that it was our job as parents to protect their right to wonder and dream." "And you shared that philosophy?" "I did." The Duke's expression grew distant with memory. "I was a different man then. I played piano for her while she sang, chased our children through the gardens, told them bedtime stories in voices that made them giggle. I believed that love was the strongest force in the universe, that as long as we had each other, nothing could truly harm us." Caroline could see the man he had been in his words, a loving husband and father who had believed in the power of family, in the safety of love. What changed? The Duke's face darkened, and his handwriting became sharp again. The fever. It came in the winter of 1819, sweeping through the county like a plague. Isabella caught it first. She had been visiting the tenants' children, bringing them food and medicine. She always said we had a duty to care for those less fortunate. Caroline waited, sensing that this was the heart of his pain, the moment that had shattered his faith in love and safety. "She was so ill," the Duke continued, his pen moving across the paper with increasing agitation. "Burning with fever, delirious, calling out for the children. For me. I sat beside her bed for days, holding her hand, trying to will her back to health. But then I fell ill too, and when I woke..." He stopped writing, his hand trembling slightly as he set down the pen. "When you woke, she was gone," Caroline said softly, understanding flooding through her. The Duke nodded, his grey eyes bright with unshed tears. "She had been calling for me," the servant said, "calling my name over and over, begging me to help her. But I couldn't hear her. The fever had taken my hearing, and I lay unconscious while my wife died alone, crying out for a husband who couldn't answer." Caroline felt tears spring to her own eyes at the devastating image he painted. "Jonathan," she said, using his given name for the first time. It wasn't your fault. You were ill, unconscious. There was nothing you could have done, wasn't there? He wrote with bitter precision. If I had been able to hear her, I might have woken, might have called for the physician sooner, might have saved her. Instead, I failed in the most fundamental duty of a husband, to protect the woman I loved. You didn't fail, Caroline said firmly. You were a victim of the same illness that took her. Blaming yourself for being unconscious is like blaming yourself for breathing. You don't understand, the Duke wrote, his handwriting becoming increasingly erratic. I was supposed to be her protector, her strength. Instead, I became another burden for her to worry about. She died alone because I was too weak to be what she needed. Caroline stared at this broken man who had spent 3 years torturing himself with guilt and self-recrimination, and felt her heart break for him. Is that why you've withdrawn from the children? Because you're afraid of failing them too? The Duke's silence was answer enough. Jonathan, Caroline said gently, your children don't need a perfect father. They need a loving one. They need the man who used to chase them through gardens and tell them bedtime stories. They need their papa, not this stranger who's so afraid of loving them that he's forgotten how to be present in their lives. What if I lose them too? He wrote, the words stark and vulnerable on the page. What if I allow myself to love them fully and something happens to them? What if my inability to hear puts them in danger, the way it did Isabella? Caroline felt understanding dawn. The Duke's withdrawal wasn't just about grief, it was about terror. He had convinced himself that his deafness made him inadequate as a protector, that loving his children fully would somehow put them at risk. Love doesn't make you weak, Caroline said firmly. It makes you strong. Your children need to know that they're worth fighting for, worth living for. They need to see that their father believes life is still beautiful, even after loss. How can I tell them life is beautiful when I can no longer hear their laughter? The Duke wrote, his pain evident in every stroke of the pen. Because beauty isn't just about what we can hear, Caroline replied. It's about what we can see, what we can feel, what we can share. You may not be able to hear Catherine singing, but you can see the joy on her face when she sings. You may not be able to hear Thomas's excited explanations about engineering, but you can see his passion for learning. Love isn't diminished by silence, Jonathan. It's expressed in 1,000 different ways. The Duke stared at her for a long moment, and Caroline could see him wrestling with ideas that challenged everything he had believed about his limitations. You make it sound simple, he wrote finally. It is simple, Caroline said. Not easy, but simple. Your children love you. They want their father back. They want to share their lives with you, to include you in their joys and dreams and discoveries. All you have to do is let them. And if I fail them, if my deafness prevents me from protecting them when they need me most, then we'll face that challenge together, Caroline said without hesitation. You're not alone anymore, Jonathan. You have me. You have Mrs. Hartwell. You have an entire household of people who care about this family. Your deafness doesn't make you inadequate. It just means we need to find new ways to communicate, new systems to ensure everyone's safety. The Duke looked down at the miniature portrait of his late wife, his expression softening with memory and love. She would have liked you, he wrote suddenly. Isabella always said that courage came in many forms, and that the bravest people were often those who chose to hope when hope seemed impossible. She sounds like a remarkable woman, Caroline said, and I think she would want her children to remember her with joy, not sorrow. I think she would want them to sing and laugh and fill this house with music again. The music room, the Duke wrote, his handwriting hesitant. I couldn't bear to hear them playing her favorite songs, singing the lullabies she used to sing to them. It felt like betrayal. It felt like loss, Caroline corrected gently. But music isn't betrayal, Jonathan. It's memory made beautiful. It's a way of keeping her spirit alive in this house, of honoring the joy she brought to your family. The Duke was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire as if seeking guidance from the dancing flames. When he finally looked at Caroline again, she saw something different in his eyes. Not the cold distance she had grown accustomed to, but a tentative warmth, a possibility of hope. I don't know how to be the man I was before, he wrote. I don't know how to be a father to children who have learned to live without me. You don't have to be the man you were before, Caroline said softly. You just have to be willing to become the man you could be now. Your children don't need perfection, Jonathan. They need presence. They need to know that you see them, that you value them, that you're proud of who they're becoming. And you, he wrote, his grey eyes searching her face. What do you need from this marriage, from this family? The question caught Caroline off guard with its directness and vulnerability. "I need to matter," she said honestly. "I need to know that my presence here makes a difference, that I'm not just fulfilling a contract, but actually building something meaningful. I need to be part of a family that chooses to love each other, even when it's difficult." "You do matter," the Duke wrote, his handwriting firm and certain. "You've accomplished more in 3 days than I have in 3 years. You've reminded my children that they're allowed to be happy, that their dreams and talents have value. You've reminded me that isolation isn't protection, it's just another form of death." Caroline felt tears spring to her eyes at his words. "Does that mean you're willing to try? To let your children back into your heart? To risk loving them fully again?" The Duke looked once more at his wife's portrait, then carefully placed it back in the cabinet. When he turned to Caroline, his expression was resolute. "It means I'm willing to learn," he wrote, "to find new ways of being present, new ways of communicating, new ways of showing them that they are the most important thing in my world. Will you help me?" "Always," Caroline said without hesitation. "We'll figure it out together." As she rose to leave, the Duke caught her hand, his touch gentle but firm. When she looked back at him, he was holding a piece of paper with a single word written on it. "Stay." Caroline felt her heart skip a beat at the simple request, at the vulnerability it represented. This man who had spent 3 years in self-imposed isolation was asking her not to leave him alone with his thoughts and regrets. She settled back into her chair, and together they sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to embers while the abbey settled into quiet around them. It wasn't the oppressive silence Caroline had grown to dread, but something warmer, the peaceful quiet of 2 people who had found understanding, who were no longer afraid to share the same space. Tomorrow, Caroline knew, would bring new challenges, new opportunities to heal the wounds that had festered in this family for too long. But tonight, for the first time since arriving at Whitmore Abbey, she felt hope. The Duke was ready to fight for his children, ready to risk his heart again in service of love. And Caroline would be there to help him every step of the way, to remind him that some things, love, family, the courage to hope, were worth any risk. The silence might be profound, but love, Caroline had learned, could speak louder than words. The music of healing. Caroline woke the next morning to an unprecedented sound, the gentle murmur of conversation drifting through her chambers from the corridor beyond. Not the careful whispers that had characterized the Abbey since her arrival, but actual voices speaking at normal volumes, punctuated by what sounded suspiciously like laughter. She dressed quickly and made her way toward the breakfast room, following the sounds of this domestic miracle. What she found there took her breath away. The Duke sat at the table with his children, not at the head in isolated formality, but in the middle of their chatter, his grey eyes focused intently on their faces as he read their lips with obvious concentration. "Papa, you should see Thomas's new design for a bridge," Elizabeth was saying, her voice bright with excitement. "It's quite ingenious. He's solved the problem of weight distribution by using a series of interconnected arches." The Duke turned to his son with genuine interest, writing quickly, "Show me these plans. I should like to understand the engineering principles." Thomas's face lit up with such joy that Caroline felt tears prick her eyes. This was what she had hoped to see, a father engaging with his children's interests, showing them that their passions mattered to him. "Good morning," Caroline said softly, not wanting to break the spell of this family moment. "Caroline," the Duke said aloud, his voice rusty from disuse but warm with welcome. The sound of him speaking her name sent a shock through her. She hadn't realized how much she had longed to hear his voice. "Papa's talking to us," Catherine announced with delight, bouncing slightly in her chair. "He said good morning and asked about my dreams and everything." Caroline met the Duke's eyes across the table and saw something there that made her heart race. Gratitude, yes, but also something deeper, something that looked remarkably like affection. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Caroline said, settling into the chair beside him. "What else have you been discussing?" "Everything," William exclaimed. "Papa wants to see my drawings, and he said Margaret could show him her poetry, and he asked Elizabeth about her French lessons. And he said we could have music lessons again," Catherine added, her grey eyes shining with happiness. "Real lessons, with the piano and everything." Caroline looked at the Duke in surprise. This was a significant concession given his reaction the previous day. "Are you certain?" she asked gently. The Duke nodded, though she could see the effort it cost him. "The children should not be denied their talents because of my Difficulties, he wrote on a piece of paper, showing it to Caroline. Perhaps you could help me find a way to appreciate their music without being overwhelmed by memory. Of course, Caroline said, understanding the courage it had taken for him to make this decision. We'll take it slowly, find ways that work for everyone. After breakfast, the Duke surprised everyone by suggesting a tour of the estate grounds. I realize, he said, his voice growing stronger with use, that I have been absent from many aspects of family life. Perhaps it's time to remedy that. The children's excitement was palpable as they bundled into warm coats and scarves for their first family outing in 3 years. Caroline watched the Duke with his children, seeing how he positioned himself so he could see their faces when they spoke, how he asked questions that showed genuine interest in their thoughts and observations. "The lake is frozen solid," Margaret observed as they walked through the winter gardens. "We used to skate here when we were younger." "I remember," the Duke said softly, his expression growing distant with memory. "Your mother loved to skate. She was quite graceful on the ice." Caroline held her breath, waiting to see if the mention of his late wife would cause him to retreat again. But instead, the Duke seemed to gather himself. "Would you like to try skating again?" he asked. "I could have the ice checked for safety, perhaps arrange for skates to be brought from the village." The children's faces lit up with wonder, as if he had offered them the moon. "Really, Papa?" Catherine asked. "We could skate like we used to." "Not exactly like we used to," the Duke said honestly. "I won't be able to hear if you call for help, so we'll need to establish signals, ways to communicate on the ice. But yes, I think we could find a way to make it work." Caroline felt her heart swell with pride at his thoughtfulness. He wasn't pretending his deafness didn't exist, but he also wasn't using it as an excuse to avoid participating in his children's lives. "We could use flags," Thomas suggested eagerly. "Different colors for different signals. Red for danger, yellow for help needed, green for all clear." "An excellent idea," the Duke agreed, and Caroline saw Thomas stand a little straighter at his father's approval. As they continued their walk, Caroline found herself falling into step beside the Duke while the children ranged ahead of them, their voices carrying on the crisp winter air. "This is wonderful," she said softly, "seeing you with them like this." "It's terrifying," the Duke admitted, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Every instinct tells me to retreat, to protect myself from the possibility of loss. But watching their faces this morning, seeing how hungry they are for attention, for approval, I realized that my fear was robbing them of more than it was protecting me from." "Fear often does that," Caroline observed. "It promises safety, but delivers isolation." "You were right yesterday," the Duke said, glancing at her with something that might have been admiration. "About Isabella, about what she would want for the children. She always said that love was meant to be shared, not hoarded, that joy multiplied when it was given freely. She sounds like she was very wise." "She was, and she would have liked you very much." The Duke paused in his walking, turning to face Caroline directly. "I owe you an apology for my behavior yesterday, for my reaction in the music room. You were trying to help the children, and I allowed my own pain to blind me to their needs." "You don't need to apologize," Caroline said gently. "You were protecting yourself the only way you knew how. But I'm glad you've decided to try a different approach." "I'm glad you didn't give up on us," the Duke replied, his grey eyes warm with sincerity. "On me. It would have been easier to simply accept the distance, to fulfill the terms of our marriage without challenging my walls." "Easier, perhaps," Caroline agreed, "but not right. Your children deserve better, and so do you." They were interrupted by Catherine running back to them, her cheeks pink with cold and excitement. "Papa, look," she called, pointing to a robin perched on a nearby branch. "He's singing even though it's winter. Do you think he's happy?" The Duke knelt down to his daughter's level, bringing his eyes level with hers. "I think," he said carefully, "that some creatures sing not because they're happy, but because singing is part of who they are. Perhaps the robin sings because he knows that the world needs music, even in winter." "Like how we need music even when we're sad?" Catherine asked with the profound insight of childhood. "Exactly like that," the Duke agreed, and Caroline saw him blink back tears at his daughter's understanding. That afternoon, the Duke kept his promise about music lessons. He arranged for the music room to be properly aired and cleaned, and then, with obvious effort, he sat in a chair near the piano while Caroline worked with the children on simple songs and exercises. "I can't hear the music," he explained to them, "but I can see your faces when you sing. I can see the joy it brings you, and that's a kind of music too." Caroline watched him throughout the lesson, noting how he focused intently on each child's expression, how he applauded their efforts even though he couldn't hear the results. It was a profound act of love, participating in something that caused him pain because he recognized its importance to his children. "Papa," Elizabeth said during a break in the lesson, "would you like me to describe the music to you? Tell you what it sounds like?" The Duke's expression grew thoughtful. "I would like that very much. Help me understand what I'm missing." What followed was one of the most beautiful conversations Caroline had ever witnessed. Elizabeth, with the passionate vocabulary of a young person discovering art, described the music in terms of color and emotion, texture and movement. She spoke of melodies that danced like sunlight on water, of harmonies that felt like warm embraces, of rhythms that echoed the beating of hearts. "Music is like feelings made into sound," Catherine added, her childish wisdom cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "When I sing, it's like my happiness gets to fly around the room." The Duke listened to his daughter's descriptions with rapt attention, and Caroline could see him beginning to understand that his deafness didn't have to cut him off from the beauty of music. It simply meant he needed to experience it differently. Would you play something for me?" he asked Caroline suddenly. "Something Isabella used to love. Elizabeth can describe it, and perhaps I can learn to appreciate music through your eyes and voices." Caroline felt the weight of the request, the trust it represented. She chose a simple piece, a gentle waltz that spoke of love and hope and the enduring power of memory. As she played, Elizabeth provided a running commentary, describing the rise and fall of the melody, the way the different voices wove together, the emotions the music evoked. The Duke watched and listened with complete focus, his grey eyes moving between Caroline's hands on the keys and his daughter's animated face. When the piece ended, he was quiet for a long moment. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion, "for helping me understand that beauty doesn't disappear just because we experience it differently, for showing me that love can find new ways to express itself." As the afternoon faded into evening and the children were sent to prepare for dinner, Caroline found herself alone with the Duke in the music room. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with understanding rather than tension. "Caroline," the Duke said suddenly, his voice soft but clear, "I want you to know that this marriage, what began as a necessity, has become something I treasure. You've given me back my children, my family, my hope. You've shown me that love isn't something to be feared, but something to be celebrated." Caroline felt her heart race at his words, at the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her. "Jonathan," she began, then stopped, unsure how to express the depth of her own feelings. "I know we married for practical reasons," the Duke continued, moving closer to her, "but I find myself hoping that perhaps in time we might find something deeper, something real." "We already have," Caroline said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "What I feel for you, for this family, it's not duty or obligation. It's love, real, honest, overwhelming love." The Duke's face transformed with joy and relief, and he reached out to cup her face in his hands. "I love you too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I never thought I would love again, never wanted to risk that kind of vulnerability. But you've made me remember that love isn't a risk to be avoided, but a gift to be treasured." When he kissed her, it was with the passion of a man who had rediscovered hope, who had learned that the heart could heal without forgetting, could love again without betraying the past. Caroline melted into his embrace, feeling complete for the first time in her life. They were interrupted by the sound of children's voices in the corridor, not the careful whispers of before, but natural, happy chatter. The sound made them both smile, a reminder of how far they had all come. "Our family," the Duke said softly, the words carrying a weight of promise and commitment. "Our family," Caroline agreed, and in those simple words she heard the echo of all the love songs yet to be sung, all the laughter yet to be shared, all the joy yet to be discovered. The silence had been broken, replaced by something far more beautiful. The music of a family learning to love again, the harmony of hearts that had found their way back to hope. The Symphony of Love. 6 months later, the sound of laughter echoed through Whitmore Abbey on a warm June morning, drifting from the music room where the entire family had gathered for what had become their daily tradition, morning music together. Caroline sat at the piano, her fingers dancing over the keys while the children sang in harmony, their voices blending in a song that spoke of joy and hope and the enduring power of love. The Duke stood near the window, his grey eyes bright with contentment as he watched his family make music together. He had learned to read the rhythm in their movements, to see the melody in their expressions, to understand that music was indeed the language of the heart, and hearts, he had discovered, could be read in many ways. "Papa!" Catherine called, running to him with the unconscious confidence of a child who knew she was loved. "Did you see how high my voice went on that last note?" "I did indeed," the Duke replied, kneeling to her level with the easy affection that had become second nature to him. "You looked like a bird taking flight. It was beautiful." Caroline watched the exchange with the deep satisfaction of someone who had witnessed a miracle. The transformation in this family over the past months had been profound, not just in the Duke's willingness to engage with his children, but in the children's renewed confidence, their blossoming talents, their obvious security in their father's love. "Lady Caroline," Margaret said, using the formal address that had evolved into a term of affection rather than distance. "Mrs. Pemberton says the picnic is ready. Shall we head to the lake?" The family picnic had been the Duke's idea, a way to celebrate the anniversary of what he privately called the day Caroline brought music back to our house. It had become a monthly tradition, these outdoor gatherings, where they could simply be together without the formality that still occasionally crept into their daily routines. As they made their way through the Abbey's gardens toward the lake, Caroline felt a familiar sense of wonder at how completely her life had changed. She had arrived at Whitmore Abbey as a frightened 19-year-old with nothing to offer but her willingness to try. Now she was a duchess, a mother to 5 remarkable children, and the wife of a man who loved her with a depth that took her breath away. "What are you thinking about?" the Duke asked, falling into step beside her while the children raced ahead toward the picnic spot. "Just all of this," Caroline said, gesturing around them at the scene of domestic happiness. "6 months ago, I never could have imagined being so content." "6 months ago," the Duke replied, taking her hand in his. "I never could have imagined being happy again at all. You've given me more than a second chance, Caroline. You've given me a second life." "We've given each other that," Caroline corrected, echoing words that had become something of a family motto. As they settled on blankets beside the lake, watching their children play and laugh with the freedom of young people who knew they were safe and loved, Caroline reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. It hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks, moments when old fears resurfaced, times when the Duke's grief threatened to overwhelm his newfound hope. But they had faced each challenge together, learning to communicate not just through words but through touch, through shared glances, through the 1,000 small gestures that made up the language of love. The Duke had learned to trust his children's safety to others when his deafness made supervision difficult. The children had learned to include their father in their activities in ways that accommodated his needs while honoring their own. "Caroline," Thomas said, settling beside her on the blanket, "I've been thinking about the engineering principles we discussed last week. I believe I've solved the problem with the bridge design." Caroline smiled at the boy's enthusiasm, remembering how withdrawn and careful he had been when she first arrived. Now he was confident, eager to share his ideas, secure in the knowledge that his interests were valued and supported. "Tell me about it," she said, giving him her full attention. As Thomas launched into an excited explanation of stress distribution and load-bearing calculations, Caroline was aware of the Duke listening intently, asking thoughtful questions that showed his genuine interest in his son's passion. This was what she had hoped to achieve, not just a family that functioned, but one that flourished. "Lady Caroline," Elizabeth said during a lull in the conversation, "I've written a new poem. Would you like to hear it?" "Always," Caroline replied warmly. Elizabeth stood and began to recite, her voice clear and confident. "In silence deep, a heart once dwelt, where love lay sleeping, barely felt. But music came on gentle wings, and taught that heart how sorrow sings. Not songs of grief, but melodies of hope that dances through the trees, of children's laughter, bright and true, of love that makes all things new. The silence broke, the heart awoke, and found that love's the strongest stroke that paints upon life's canvas wide, a masterpiece of joy and pride." The poem was met with enthusiastic applause from the entire family, but Caroline noticed that the Duke had tears in his eyes. When Elizabeth finished, he rose and embraced his daughter with obvious pride. "That was beautiful," he said, his voice thick with emotion. You have a true gift for capturing truth in words." "I learned from the best teacher," Elizabeth replied, glancing meaningfully at Caroline. "Someone who showed me that feelings are meant to be expressed, not hidden." As the afternoon wore on, Caroline found herself marveling at the easy affection that now characterized this family's interactions. William showed his father his latest sketches, receiving detailed feedback and genuine encouragement. Margaret discussed her reading with the Duke, their conversation ranging from philosophy to poetry, with the kind of intellectual respect that made the girl glow with confidence. And little Catherine. Catherine climbed onto her father's lap with the unconscious trust of a child who had never doubted her welcome, chattering about everything and nothing, while the Duke listened with the focused attention of a man who had learned that every moment with his children was precious. "Papa," Catherine said suddenly, "are you happy now?" The Duke considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes, sweetheart," he said finally. "I am very happy." "Are you?" "The happiest," Catherine declared, with the absolute certainty of childhood. "We have music and laughter and picnics and each other. What more could anyone want?" "Nothing," the Duke said softly, his grey eyes meeting Caroline's over his daughter's head. "Nothing at all." As the sun began to set and they gathered their picnic things for the walk back to the Abbey, Caroline felt the Duke's hand slip into hers. The simple gesture sent warmth through her entire being, a reminder of how far they had all come from that first awkward meeting in the library. "Thank you," he said quietly, his words meant for her alone. "For what?" "For refusing to accept that broken things couldn't be mended. For believing that love was worth fighting for. For teaching us all that silence isn't the absence of sound, it's simply another way of listening." Caroline squeezed his hand, feeling the solid warmth of his presence, the security of his love. "Thank you for letting me into your heart, into your family, for showing me what it means to belong somewhere completely." As they walked back toward the Abbey, surrounded by the chatter and laughter of their children, Caroline reflected on the miracle of their transformation. She had been forced to marry a rich, deaf duke, expecting nothing more than a marriage of convenience. Instead, she had found the deepest, most sincere love she could have imagined. The Duke had been trapped in silence and grief, convinced that love was too dangerous to risk. But he had learned that love wasn't the enemy of safety. It was the foundation of everything that made life worth living. And their children. Their children had learned that they were worthy of love, that their talents and dreams mattered, that happiness wasn't something to be rationed, but something to be celebrated. As Whitmore Abbey came into view, its windows glowing with welcoming light, Caroline knew that she was looking at more than just a house. She was looking at a home, a place where love had triumphed over fear, where music had conquered silence, where a family had learned to heal together. The silence might have brought them together, but it was love, deep, sincere, transformative love, that would keep them united for all the years to come. Did this story of silent love speaking louder than words touch your heart? If Caroline and Jonathan's journey from arranged marriage to deep, sincere love moved you, smash that like button now. Don't forget to subscribe for more breathtaking historical romances that prove love can overcome any obstacle. Share in the comments. What was your favorite moment? The first time the Duke spoke to his children, or when Caroline brought music back to their lives? Let's celebrate love that finds a way to communicate beyond words.